Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ruth McCambridge. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly, and I want to welcome you today to our webinar on the role of the board in nonprofit strategic alliances. And before I say anything else, I want to say that we're happy to do this today with one of our partners in many strategic alliances, actually, BoardSource, and we work a lot together on various kinds of projects, long and short term. And so it seems particularly apt that we do this today with you, Anne. So
indeed.
Yeah. So as we get started on this, I do want to say that the term strategic alliances includes a lot of different kinds of relationships between organizations. And so some of our strategic alliances are relatively informal, done on a handshake, if you will, but basically an agreement between two organizations to get something done together. And in a lot of those cases, it's based on a level of trust that, we've done this kind of thing or some semblance of this kind of thing before, and you can over time commit to longer and deeper relationships in that way. So a lot of strategic alliances start at a very informal level, but there are strategic alliances that include mergers and acquisitions that are on kind of the other end of a continuum. I usually think of it as a continuum of autonomy and accountability. Is that your autonomy in relationships like the one that we and BoardSource have it's pretty much your autonomy. It stays the same. You negotiate the terms of the particular project that you're in, but it leaves you essentially the same afterwards. A little better because you've done something wonderful with somebody else, but it leaves you essentially the same with the same decision-making apparatus, etc. When you get to the other end of the continuum of relationships, it includes mergers and acquisitions, and those are generally relationships that are covered by contracts and require a lot of due diligence and that kind of thing. So the role of the board in kind of the crafting of those, it gets more intense towards that second end of things. But it's always useful for the board to understand, even at the more informal end of things, who you have good trust relationships with that turn into assets for the organization and for the constituents of the organization. Those things, it helps the board understand where you are in the context of a big network of organizations that are doing work that, that can be connected for better purpose. So that said, we're going to talk a lot today about everything from the informal to the more formal. And we hope to address a lot of your questions today in a little bit of an extended question and answer period, which is a good reason for me to keep it short as I'm introducing this. We're very lucky to be joined today by Ann Wallstad, who's the president and CEO of BoardSource and one of NPQ's most popular presenters. And we're also pleased to welcome Jennifer Greger Holland, Associate Vice President of Consulting and Learning Practice at BoardSource. And Jennifer will primarily join us at the end of this webinar for the question and answer period. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Now for a couple of logistics. As I always say, we're going to send you the slides and the audio after this presentation, so you don't need to ask me that again, but we do welcome all of your questions about the content of today's webinar. And you can send them in at any time. I will be facilitating. I'll choose the questions that haven't been covered, and I'll be facilitating that piece of our, of our work together. This webinar, thank goodness, is brought to you by Network for Good. And this is the reason why we can bring you this for free. Network for Good offers innovative and easy donor management software, fundraising pages, personal fundraising coaches. Network for Good's goal is to provide nonprofits with a complete fundraising solution that will securely and efficiently support their mission. Cultivate your donors and generate new ones. So again, the conversations around this topic are important, and particularly because I think that I have been doing work in this sector for 50 years. And I think there used to be this very laborious kind of discussion about what you had to do to collaborate. Now, if you're not in 5 to 10 to 20 collaborations at any particular time, you're probably not doing your job. So I think we've figured out how to kind of develop the processes around the intentions, the closeness, the term of engagement. And so I'm going to hand this over now to Anne, who will walk us through what it is that we're exactly talking about and where the board really needs to pay attention and get involved. Anne?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you again for having us. It's fun to be with you and to be with Nonprofit Quarterly on talking about a topic that is really important. And when I say that, that's really informed by our belief at BoardSource that there is tremendous power when nonprofit organizations come together and think about how can we do together what we may not be able to do as well, as impactfully, as efficiently alone. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about strategic alliances. We're going to spend some time at the top of this hour just sharing some context for our conversation. And then, as Ruth shared, really are leaving the latter half of this hour for your questions. And the content that I'm going to share up front and the things that I'm going to be talking about acknowledge that the board has an important role to play in strategic alliances. And I would characterize that as having two key components to it. One is a technical role. And as Ruth highlighted, with all of the different types of strategic alliances, the board plays more of an involved technical role in the more intense, more structural, more binding, long-term strategic alliances. But sometimes when we talk about the board's role, we focus only there. And we're going to spend most of our time talking about what we consider to be a huge opportunity for boards to think differently about their strategic role as it relates to strategic alliances and all of the ways that organizations can work together. So with that as framing in terms of how we're going to approach this conversation, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So as BoardSource acknowledged that we felt like there was a role for us to play in terms of helping boards think more strategically and proactively, and I would say openly, about strategic alliances and restructuring, we wanted to start by understanding, well, where are we as a sector? How are boards thinking and feeling and acting, behaving around the concept of strategic alliances and restructuring now? And there was some really interesting news there. The majority of boards, 62%, indicated that, in fact, they are open to exploring strategic alliances and restructuring. So while there is still in the nonprofit or social sector a lot of anxiety and angst about strategic alliances and restructuring, and in particular mergers, there is a sense amongst a lot of boards of opportunity and optimism and openness, which we thought was really, really positive and made us very hopeful just in terms of what may be possible as boards engage and think differently about the opportunity. We were also really intrigued to see that certain types of boards seem to be more open to strategic alliances and restructuring. So boards that were having a greater positive impact, self-reported, in terms of organizational performance, were more open to strategic alliances and restructuring. Similarly, boards that had chairs that were doing really well in terms of framing strategic questions and other important deliberative functions reported greater openness. And also boards that were really clear on their values. These things all made sense to us in terms of why that would be, because these are three critical things, just in terms of overall board performance, and I would say in terms of the chair's role and values-driven decision-making, really important in all aspects of the board's work, but in particular as it relates to strategic alliances and restructuring, because it really requires being focused on the North Star of what your organization is trying to do. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. With that as just grounding for where we're starting. One of the things that we identified early on in our work, and I should mention right at the top that Board Source's work on strategic alliances and restructuring has been in partnership with a number of other organizations through an initiative called The Power of Possibility, and I'll share some more information about that in a bit. But our partners in this work are groups that include, La Piana Consulting, Bridgespan, and Propel Nonprofits out of the Twin Cities, as well as the Lodestar Foundation, the Patterson Foundation, and the Lyda Hill Foundation, groups that have been working in the space of strategic alliances and restructuring for a long time. So this is not just sort of our observations or our research from our work with boards, but it's really building on the expertise of those subject matter experts with whom we've partnered on this initiative. With all that said, there are some key trends that have been observed in terms of moments in an organization's history or life cycle that seem to be really rich with opportunities to take that step back and consider strategic alliances and restructuring. And so through our work with The Power of Possibility, we've really zeroed in on those moments and are encouraging boards that are in one of those moments to really think proactively about how strategic alliances and restructuring might help an organization advance its goals, or how in a moment, which we're going to go deeper on here in a second, how in one of these moments you can really take the opportunity to step back and say, hey, is there a different way for us to do things? Do we have an opportunity here? So those 6 key moments are executive transition, strategy and planning, innovation and scale, adapting to change, closing the doors, or starting a new nonprofit. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and just talk about each of those a bit more specifically. So this has been observed in research that many successful strategic alliances and restructuring, and I would say especially at the more structural long-term end of the spectrum, things like mergers and acquisitions, many of them are synced with the moment of executive transition. That's not to say that that can't happen in other moments, but there is a unique opportunity when an organization is either planning or going through an executive transition that may just make it easier to have conversations across leaders, boards, and organizations about whether or not that could be an opportunity for a merger or another type of strategic alliance or restructuring. Through The Power of Possibility, we've had the opportunity to really listen and learn about stories of success that have happened across the nonprofit sector. And there are some incredible stories around executive transition. One of my favorites is the story of 2 organizations that were actually both going through an executive transition, and the board chairs of the 2 organizations were riding the elevator together. This was 2 Boston-based organizations riding the elevator together and chatting about their searches, and both had an aha moment that, hey, we might actually have a really successful search and a really successful strategic merging of our two organizations, and this is an opportunity for us to do that. And that's, in fact, what happened. They came together as a part of a formal merger and were able to strengthen both organizations, hire and attract a really talented leader, and advance both of the organizations' missions in a way that they would not have been able to do on their own. And that moment of executive transition was what revealed to them that how powerful that opportunity could be. So we, through the Power of Possibility initiative, have provided some resources to boards around each of these moments and discussion guides that help boards really step back and say, okay, we're in this moment. What do we need to be thinking about? Executive transition is one of those best examples, that boards have an opportunity, instead of rushing to immediately do a search or fill the position, to really step back and say, is this an opportunity for us? Is this a moment where we could be thinking about coming together with another organization rather than continuing to exist in the same corporate structure that we are today? Let's go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about strategy and planning, innovation and scale, and adapting to change all together, because really what we're talking about in all of these categories, though it may be for different reasons, is an opportunity for a board to say, we need to think big, or we are thinking big about what's next for our organization, thinking about what we're trying to accomplish, thinking about how we're going to adjust to a major change in funding or in the policy environment, thinking about how we can take a leap forward in terms of our own innovation, our own scale. There are lots of stories of organizations that have used one of these moments to come together in very creative ways. And one of my favorite stories, which came from a challenge, is about the Dayton Performing Alliance. 3 separate arts and cultural organizations that were all facing real threats to their sustainability from a financial perspective due to the economic downturn in 2008 and 2009. So they were all thinking about, how do we cut back? How do we retool? How do we do things differently? What might we need to abandon or eliminate? And in the context of those conversations, they realized that there may actually be an opportunity to think differently about what it would take to survive, and not just survive, but thrive. Ended up coming together as a single institution focused on I'm not coming up with the right word, but essentially a way of doing arts programming that wasn't single mode. So they now actually have had an opportunity to be incredibly creative, innovative, and cutting edge with their arts programming through partnership, but it all was prompted by the need to think differently about their sustainability and their business model. And I love that story because, sometimes a strategic alliance and restructuring, the impetus for it may not feel like a happy occurrence, though certainly there are plenty examples of organizations that start with a really positive kind of approach to how do we do more, how do we do better, how do we do differently. But these were organizations that were facing some challenges, and even so, the opportunity to come together really enabled them not only to survive, as I said before, but really to see very positive benefits programmatically and a genuine sense that they are better together than they were on their own, which is obviously what you hope for as you set about on these paths to think about strategic partnership with another organization or set of organizations. Let's go ahead to the next slide then. So closing the doors, unfortunately, there are times where organizations do feel like they're in a situation where they're just not surviving as an organization. And of course, that can happen for a number of different reasons. What we're trying to encourage organizations and boards to think about if they may be in or approaching that moment is how can you think strategically about what your organization has accomplished, its contributions, assets, sort of intellectual property, and how can that continue to live on through another organization or another organization's work and efforts, so that instead of just hitting a wall and stopping and losing the value and contributions of everything that the board and the organization's staff have worked so incredibly hard on, that there can actually be a value add to another organization that is serving a similar or well-aligned purpose. That takes effort, that takes thoughtfulness, that takes planning, that takes not waiting until the very, very end for that to be able to happen. And in particular, in this moment, the board may need to be prepared to do that somewhat independently or on their own, depending on where they are in that process. So helping boards really think about their organization's legacy and continued impact if they are in that unfortunate situation. And then the final, we can move to the next slide, the final moment that creates a special opportunity for boards to think about strategic alliances and restructuring is when a board is starting a new nonprofit. And this is a little bit of an odd duck in terms of the other things that we talk about, but we think it's really important for organizations before they form themselves to really think about the rest of the nonprofit ecosystem and whether or not they are serving a truly unique need or serving a need in a unique way. And that there may be ways that organizations that are newly forming may set themselves up to give themselves the flexibility to more easily align with another organization if in fact it comes to be that makes sense for them. So considering things like starting as a fiscally sponsored organization rather than immediately going to setting up an independent 501c3 can be a really effective way for a new entity, a new board, to say, we're not sure where we should be going in terms of a long-term corporate structure. We might be our own 501c3. We might be a really strong program of an existing organization. And before we commit ourselves to being that independent corporate structure, we're gonna set ourselves up so that we can really focus on the program and building the work that we think is important, and give ourselves the flexibility to structure ourselves differently, more easily in the future. So in all of these moments, we really have the opportunity as boards to show up as leaders in important ways, and to really tap into our ability to think strategically, to be creative, and to bring openness and humility to our organization's work. And what I mean by that is, an organization whose board is thinking about, their own brand, their own turf, their own success out of context of the rest of the ecosystem, is going to struggle to see the upside or the opportunity of strategic alliances and restructuring, or may struggle to be able to effectively come together with another organization. So it really does take leadership at the board level that is truly purpose-driven and that is focused on what are we trying to do here, and what's most important in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, and what does that mean in terms of how we might work with other organizations. So commitment to purpose versus corporate structure, which of course makes perfect sense and sounds easy, but takes actually all of these elements for boards to be able to do that well. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So how do you start a conversation in the boardroom? Well, we're going to have a link here to the Power of Possibility in a second, but that's one of the best ways, is to tap into some of the discussion guide resources and PowerPoint decks that are available through that, because we're really wanting to help tee up those conversations and make it easier for board members and executives to introduce a conversation within the boardroom. Excuse me. But going back to that concept of purpose, it really does start with the board grounding itself in what are we trying to do here, what's most important, what, when it comes down to it, is our reason for being. And when boards start there, rather than, what did we map out in terms of our strategy, or what is our specific mission statement, it really can unlock new potential, new openness, new visibility into what might be possible. We often, or we can, get so connected, kind of in love with our own plans. And also, I would say that, as nonprofits, or at least those that fundraise, we're used to making the case for how we're different. We're sort of focused on differentiation. It takes going back to kind of the more fundamental question about why are we here and what are we trying to accomplish, sometimes to see how much we have in common or where those opportunities may exist. Related to that, it's really important that boards understand their environment and context. Who else is operating in our space? It's not all about who's doing similar things. Sometimes the best and most successful strategic alliances and restructuring are actually organizations that do different but complementary things, or that do similar things but in a different geography, which can be a part of a scale strategy. So really thinking about what's happening in our environment that may impact us, that may need to prompt us to think differently, or that is creating an opportunity for us to do so. And then finally, getting into plans and strategies, how do we think more proactively about what we think needs to be accomplished in the context of how might we accomplish it with another organization? So not assuming that just because something is important to do, that we as an individual or independent organization must do it ourselves. There's an article that we'll share that I talk about the concept of network leadership and how boards really need to think about the purpose that they have, the goals that they have in terms of what they're trying to accomplish in a broader sense, so that it's not just what we accomplish on our own, but what we facilitate and make happen. And sometimes the best way to make something happen is to let somebody else do it. So let's go ahead and go to that next slide. This is really hard to see. So I'm not going to ask you to read that. You'll read it on your own if you want to take a look at the slide. But really what we're getting at here is that spectrum of types of strategic alliances and restructuring that Ruth was talking about at the top of our call. And the fact that across that entire spectrum, so the orange box there, the board has an opportunity to be really engaged in the strategy and thinking about how could partnership, collaboration, strategic alliances, and restructuring enable us to do this differently, faster, more efficiently, better, et cetera. There are some types of strategic alliances and restructuring where the board actually has to approve the strategy because there is a formal decision that needs to be made. And then there are, as Ruth mentioned, some types of restructuring, and this is at the merger or joint venture end of the spectrum, where the board actually needs to be involved in negotiating and approving a partnership agreement. But the thing that I would share here, which is going back to the point that I made at the top of our conversation, is that just because the board doesn't need to be involved in negotiating and approving something from a technical perspective or a technical engagement in strategic alliances and restructuring, does not mean that the board shouldn't be thinking about opportunities for partnership and collaboration across the organization's work. There is no bad time for a board to be thinking about, could we do this differently or better in partnership with another organization or set of organizations? Is this really something that we must do ourselves? If we started doing this, would we be newly competing with another organization in a way that's going to actually weaken our ecosystem or the way that we're operating as a social sector? These are the types of questions that boards can and should have on their mind as they're thinking on an ongoing basis about strategy, organizational resources, and organizational impact. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So here we go. Here's a link to the Power of Possibility, which, as I mentioned, has a ton of resources and some really powerful stories about what strategic alliances and restructuring can mean in terms of greater impact on mission, on purpose. And I would really encourage you, particularly if you're in one of those 6 moments that we talked about, to tap into those resources. As I mentioned, there are discussion guides and there are actually PowerPoint decks to walk boards through conversations, and a whole bunch of other resources, including lots of great research and advice from our partners at La Piana and Bridgespan and Propel Nonprofits, as well as many others, that can be incredibly helpful to you as you start those conversations or do that thinking. But let me pause there. We're right at halfway through our hour as planned, and invite Ruth to tee up some of your questions, and invite Jennifer to join me in talking through them with you.
Hello, I'm back. And welcome, Jennifer. So I have a whole bunch of questions that I'm still in the process of categorizing, but go ahead, and if you do have any additional questions, log them in. And I guess one of the things that I'll do before I start is just make a little, start taking your questions, is make a little comment of my own, which is, what's interesting about Anne's comments is that when you're talking about like the reason, what are the kinds of boards that are very open to these possibilities, you're talking about boards that are in pretty good shape. So they understand what their strategic challenges are. They have ways to talk about those challenges, and they, so that their own decision making is actually something it looks like they're fairly confident in. And I think it's an interesting point, because I think in the past, what we used to hear all these calls for, there are too many nonprofits should merge because, some of them just don't function right. And the fact of the matter is that nonprofits more often successfully merge out of strength than out of weakness.
That's absolutely right.
And I think it's an interesting distinction. It's also a distinction that's supported by some research that was done in the Twin Cities area that looked at why do people generally want to merge, and they want to merge and acquire other organizations to extend what they're already doing well. And so that kind of really positive approach to the act of actually structurally merging a couple of organizations, I think, is a very different take on this whole realm of activity than we've experienced in the past. It used to be when you heard about a merger, it was like, oh, that's a shame, who wasn't doing well. And that's just not the case, I think, anymore. That's not where we start on these conversations. So I want to, that was one observation. The other observation was about when you were talking about constantly looking out for the opportunity, Anne. There is this great article that was written by Chris Cornforth that, and I can't remember the whole title, but it has Windows of Opportunity in the title. And it really talks about alliances between nonprofits and government organizations, and sometimes for-profit organizations. And these are more in the realm of collaborations. And what he says in some of those cases, he said, you have to look for the window of opportunity when those can work. But you as much have to look for that window will close at some point. And so to measure, is this really something I want to get into permanently? Is it something that I want to be more cautious about and have an out for? That part of what you're doing is looking to see, is that really paying off for me right now? You know, is this something that I want to lend our energy to at this point? And I think particularly in larger collaborations and some more temporary relationships, that's an important consideration as much as getting in is the getting out.
And I think,
without punishment.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things you mentioned, that, you know, there's so much talk about collaboration. I think that's one of the unfortunate things that is kind of part of that pressure to collaborate, is that it can feel like, and sometimes be, collaboration for collaboration's sake. And that's not what we're talking about. It's really important, you know, if we're going to say yes to the right kind of collaborations and strategic alliances and restructuring, that requires that we are also able to say no to the wrong ones. So there's two sides of the coin. It's not just, you know, everyone should collaborate all the time on everything, etc.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are, as I said, a lot of questions, and one of them is, are there any bad motivations for a strategic alliance?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I have some thoughts, but Jennifer, I'd love to hear what you would say here as well. You know, I think we've learned through our work on this topic that it's really, really important for organizations to understand what each other are seeking to get out of the partnership, and that there is alignment. So while that's not a bad reason in and of itself, I think that, you know, the concept of, if we're not aligned, or if our organization is trying to accomplish this and the other organization is trying to accomplish that, that may feel like you are uncovering kind of a bad reason in the other organization if it's not aligned with why you're looking to align. The other thing that we've learned is, and there are two sides of this, that funders can play a really powerfully positive role in supporting and stimulating strategic alliances and restructuring. But when funders, or if funders kind of overstep and push for or force a strategic alliance and restructuring, that can be a really bad reason. And the underlying issue there is that the organizations don't have that opportunity to make the decision about, is this a good strategic opportunity for us, or is this us just going through the motions? And we've unfortunately heard some stories of organizations that, you know, one or both, though it's particularly damaging, I think, when it's one of the organizations involved, was kind of going through the motions because a funder asked them to consider it. So those are two things that I would highlight. But Jennifer, what would you add?
I'll lean into this response by way of a story and adding a little bit more texture to the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance merger, because I think, as Anne said, there was just some tremendous outcomes from being able to merge performances from the Philharmonic, the ballet, and also the opera. And, you know, I think this idea of role, whether you're the funder or the board member or the executive director, really matters. And sometimes how motivations are perceived depends on from where you sit. And so Paul Helfrich is clear to say, you know, look, EDs have a role to play, and sometimes the board will really pick up on the tone that you set with your fellow EDs, in this case of a merger. That there's a opportunity for EDs there. And he was pretty candid too in talking about, you know, the response of donors. They weren't necessarily getting, you know, joint donations to the newly merged organization in year one, but after a period of time when donors realized this wasn't a hostile takeover, they were willing to donate to the merged entity. So I think a lot of this too is on not only clarity of the core purposes for why the partnership is happening, but also communications with different stakeholders.
So I guess one of the questions that I've had in a couple of different forms is, when and how do you, well, let me start with another question first, which is, what's the difference between a merger and an acquisition?
Jennifer, do you want to take that?
Sure. Well, it's a very specific distinction with respect to the way the legal structure is formed, and I think this really speaks to a little bit, if I may, the perception comments that I was answering in the earlier question, which is a lot of times in the nonprofit sector, mergers are seen by and large as acquisitions or hostile takeovers, because that's often how they're seen in the for-profit sector. And the reality is, based on some of the comments that you had shared, Ruth, that's not always necessarily true, that the successful mergers are ones that are really handled proactively from a place of success. And so I would suggest that folks really think through deeply kind of what their purposes are and realize that those perceptions are different in both sectors before just wagering in or actually being afraid, if you will, of taking on the conversation at all. And that's really part of what the discussion guides are designed to do, is really make those conversations feel less off-putting.
I would just piggyback on that and say, similar to what you were saying, Ruth, about, people saying, oh, I'm so sorry that you merged. Mergers and acquisitions have a very different connotation in the for-profit sector. Some of those are kind of positive, and some are negative. We did find in the research that folks that had experience with for-profit or corporate mergers and acquisitions, sometimes there was an interesting kind of split. Some, it made them much more open. Others, it made them more closed off because they had that kind of negative experience. But what I would say too is, you think about the moment of starting a new nonprofit or the moment of closing the doors, and acquisition can be a huge win. And I think we're wrong to think about acquisition as though it's always a negative, when in fact, sometimes, just like in the for-profit sector, that's the definition of success, is when you're strong enough that you have the ability to be acquired.
Right.
That's exactly right. And so that's part of what we mean when we talk about the potential strategy of a fiscally sponsored organization, is creating the space for an organization to really build up a strong program and then be nested in another organization. I just was in Detroit a couple of months ago and had an amazing conversation with a woman who's leading an organization, and they had been fiscally sponsored for a number of years and very successful, and just went out on their own as a 501c3, and she was regretting that decision. She said, I used to get to focus 100% on programs because I didn't have to think about these things that are associated with being an independent 501c3. I wish I would have never done that, and that's not to say that that's true of everyone, but it can be true sometimes. And so, being thoughtful about what opportunities are really positive in terms of purpose and mission instead of corporate structure.
Yeah. I just want to pursue this question 1 minute longer, because as we got this question about the mergers and acquisitions, one thing that occurred to me is that in a merger, it's almost being seen as a combination of two equals, whereas sometimes in an acquisition, it's just a subsuming of one under the other. And I wonder if that's just a false assumption.
Jennifer, what do you think about that?
Or they're just gradations, and it's not really kind of a clear cutoff point.
Yeah, I would unpack that based on the ingredients of the negotiation itself, and that a lot of, what gets perceived in terms of who's the quote-unquote power player in this scenario has to do with continuity of brand or primacy of brand or carryover of funders or carryover of stakeholders, and the leaders in that situation, whether it's the ED, the board, or kind of all four, if you want to think of it as two partnerships coming together in this situation, really have a huge opportunity to think about if we're going to merge for the sake of meeting a greater core purpose, how can we better serve, how can we further extend those benefits in terms of how this joining up of our two corporate structures gets perceived? And there's a lot of opportunity there, not only to think about the legal definitions of each corporation differently, but also how it's perceived based on some of those subcomponents of the negotiation.
Yeah, I actually, one of our participants just emailed and said these are on a spectrum of mutuality. And I think that's true. I think that it's not exactly there's this and then there's that. But okay, so another question about mergers and acquisitions on that end, and believe me, that's not the only questions that we're getting. So I'm going to back up and go back down that continuum soon. But how do you communicate, and how and when do you communicate your intentions for a merger? What are the kind of dangers in communicating too soon, too late? Are there any rules around that, guidelines?
So am I right in assuming that this is about external communication? So when do you start talking to your public about it? Yeah, well, Jennifer, I'd be really interested in
as well. I mean, I think that both things can get tense.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from you, Jennifer, but just a couple of thoughts from me. I don't think that there is a single answer for that, especially, well, no, I won't say that. I think whether you're talking internally or externally, I don't think that there is a single answer for that, because I do think it depends on the circumstances of each organization that are in the merger conversations. But generally, what we have learned from our research, from the stories, from our partners, is that folks rarely regret communicating too early, but do sometimes regret communicating too late. So there's a little bit of a bend towards having conversations earlier in the process than folks might think you should. That's not to say that there can't sometimes be, challenges with communicating in a big, broad way before you're really ready to do that. But being thoughtful about donor relationships, being thoughtful about being inclusive of staff in conversations, particularly when you're talking about merging organizational cultures, being thoughtful about communicating with other organizations within your community and ecosystem. Those things are important. You don't want to just, put up a new sign and say ta-da.
I'll also weigh in on this one from the standpoint of kind of a contextual example. Campaign partner La Piana helped facilitate the merger of CSI, the Center for Social Inclusion and Race Forward, and part of their story was really about getting crystal clear on the reasons for the merger. So if you think about some of the precipitating events, there was a sense of urgency around it because of police accountability trends, things happening in the news, Black Lives Matter. So that was part of you might say a driver, but also the parties involved were really careful to get quite clear about what the intended outcomes were for the merger on a staff level, on a community level, and on a societal level. And I think that level of clarity could really, in hearing Glenn Harris talk about that process really did help to drive the communications plan. And I think that would be something that would be beneficial for other organizations to think through as well.
Okay, can you talk a little bit, and this is just a kind of a definitional question, when people talk about networks and kind of network governance and networked action, as you did earlier in the presentation, and can you talk about what a kind of new responsibilities that brings to boards in general? Just kind of generally, what's the difference in the orientation that people need to bring to that boardroom?
Yeah, that's a great question that could be its own webinar. You know, I think, and I probably sound like a broken record, but I do think that there is an aspect of that is about the concept of purpose, and a board that is oriented to what are we trying to accomplish rather than who are we trying to be, and that whether you're talking about governance structures or you're talking about corporate structures, if you are married to hierarchy, married to brand, married to logo, to, you know, articulation of mission statement, to, you know, 5-year strategic plan, more than you are married to that core purpose, I think it has real challenges associated with it. And boards that are positioned to be as strategic as possible, to lead in a networked or partnership-oriented way, are as focused on the ecosystem in which they are operating and the success of that ecosystem as they are about any individual, you know, sort of successes that come out under their organization's name. And I think that fundamental orientation is something that we need a lot more of.
Right. Jennifer, did you want to talk about that?
I would agree with everything Anne said and just pose perhaps a creative question. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why we built the discussion questions to the discussion guides that we did, and really that recommendation about doing that environmental scan periodically. And for me, it's a little bit of, you know, what if we conducted those environmental scans that we typically do for strategic planning or other kinds of purposes without the presumption of organizational boundaries in mind? Or what would be a way to think about environmental scan in a little more unfettered way, if you want to put it that way.
And this goes back to the concept of, you know, network governance, but whose voices do we need, whose leadership do we need to be able to do that well? And I think, you know, that's a separate but related conversation that's really important, and is not disconnected from this, just in terms of, you know, what is an organization's relationship to its purpose and the community that it serves. So that's a connection for me.
Yeah, I like the principle of if they build it, they will come. That it's, you know, if you're creating a campaign out of whole cloth and trying to assign people to it, or engage people in it, it's harder than if you begin with a sense of this has to be a shared endeavor. And it requires all of us to kind of figure out the strategy and make it happen. That's a very different proposition than kind of leading a charge. And I think that we're becoming more and more used to doing the work that's required to do that second approach. Not in everything, obviously, but in many things. So another question that people had was, if you are, and this actually we got from 3 or 4 different people, if you are in a vulnerable financial position and you really do want to explore a relationship, are there any tips about pitching the other organization, about why they might want to take you in?
Yeah, Jennifer, I'd love for you to weigh in on this. You know, just if there are nuggets of advice from some of the stories that we collected and learned about.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about some specific contextual pieces in this exact vein, and I'll be honest, nothing is coming to mind, but as soon as we wrap, I'm sure it will, as one does. But I think just in general, principle, honesty goes a long way. I think creating safe spaces for these conversations goes a long way. I think if the organization A, for lack of a better way of thinking about this, has can presume a level of trust across board and executive staff internally, then kind of throwing out that invitation to speak with organization B in a transparent way that's safe, perhaps not broad across lots of stakeholders or immediately with funders in the room. I think there's real value to going ahead and opening the dialogue in a way that does recognize the assets, even if they may be not financial, but tangible in other ways in terms of brand and connection to stakeholders, to begin to go down that road, one step at a time.
I think it's such an interesting answer, Jennifer, and such a good one, because if you are pitching who you are to another entity, I mean, if you were to look at marrying a human being just based on what were their financial assets, that would be a pretty superficial relationship. And I think that I do think that there's a greater openness to understanding these relationships, not just in those financial terms, although that's always part of the way people consider things, but also, how does this extend our reach? Who loves this organization and will now be attached to us? What ideas and a different level of diversity does this organization bring? And what will that mean to us as an organization? What does it call on us to do and challenge us to? And I think that all of that is incredibly valuable in the thinking about, is this going to be good for us? It's not at all just a financial calculation. Okay, so one more question at least, which is, in your experience, how long do full-on mergers take to set?
Well, I'll definitely rely on Jennifer's expertise here, but I can tell you it really ranges. So can you give us a sense of short end of the spectrum or quick to long, Jennifer?
Honestly, at the risk of passing the buck even more, I think that's a better question for our subject matter experts. But I will say that it's important to think about this from the perspective of whether facilitation is needed or not. And this is actually an excellent time to talk about the resources on the campaign website. There's some great frequently asked questions and some do-it-yourself free downloadable tools, and there certainly is this concept of, do we need a facilitator or not? And mergers are just one of those things where you're far more likely to need a professional facilitator than not. That same study that Ruth was, I think it's probably the same one that Ruth was citing around mergers out of the Twin Cities area, talks about the folks that have been through a merger. I think it was 98% of executive directors and 80% of board chairs said if they had to do all over again, they'd do it with a facilitator. So it's something I would suggest is worth getting some professional help around.
Right. So any other suggestions about generally reaching out for resources? I will say there's so much more out there now. And the tone around strategic alliances has changed so much in the last 40 years that it really is a different world. But what are the resources that you would point people to specifically? Besides what's right underneath my face right now.
Well, one thing that I'll say, so first, all of the partners that we've worked with on the Power of Possibility, not only are there resources available, or many of their resources available on the Power of Possibility, but each of their own websites have tons and tons and tons of resources. So certainly looking at La Piana, Bridgespan, and Propel Nonprofits, which is the group in the Twin Cities that has done some of the research that you're mentioning. Taking a look there, they certainly have resources, and not only do they have resources, but each of them also offer that facilitation service for organizations that are entering into those conversations. So really deep, rich expertise and support there. The other thing that I would say is that the Power of Possibility really is built on the expertise of those organizations and others who have been working in that space. So most of the resources in our resource center on that site are curated from lots of different places, and they are curated with the lens of what level of detail and information and set of topics are likely to be most helpful to boards, because there's a lot of other resources and research that maybe are more detailed than boards would find, or than some boards would find helpful. So there's a lot there that's been curated with the board and the board needs and board level conversation in mind.
Great. Thank you both so much. I do want to end this by saying things have progressed so far, and as I said, in the last few decades on this topic, and they will progress further. The form of organization forms of organizations are changing so much right now, and our parameters, our boundaries are changing. It used to be that they were much, we really saw ourselves as much more standalone entities, and that's beginning to change. But now's the time, I think, when we can really begin to bring some creativity to the way we think about this. And I just want to raise one last story before we leave, which is there were two, I think they were United Way chapters that both of them, they were in joining counties, and both of them were going out to look for executives at the same time, and they hired the same person, but they didn't merge the organization. And that was their first step into thinking about, do we want to actually change and merge? Or are we, do we really see ourselves as wanting to continue to be separate? But there are a lot of ways to approach these kinds of things. And I think it is important to stay in touch with what people on the cutting edge of this stuff are doing, and to really keep an eye on the inventiveness that people are bringing to this area of work at this point. And with that, I want to say thank you so much, Anne and Jennifer, and thank you everybody for coming. And you will be getting the slides and the audio after this, but we also want to encourage you to stay in touch. Make sure that as we move along on these topics, that if you feel like there's something that you want to know more about, let us know. We'll try to bring it to you. And thanks. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.